Congratulations, you stumbled across my new video. This either means that you're a subscriber of mine, or the more likely option, you fell for my clickbait title. Sorry about that, but give me a second to explain. Yes, I know, the title of this video is Good Reasons to Leave the Church. However, this is not a video encouraging you to leave the church or deny your faith or anything like that. Hence, why the title is clickbait. Again, I apologize. If you want to skip ahead to the story, the timestamp is on the screen, but I think it's best you take a minute or two and listen to the intro to get some context of this video. The true purpose of this video is to talk about how just because you've had a bad experience with a church or some Christians mistreated you, this is not a reflection of God's love. Nowhere in the Bible does it tell people to mistreat others or be hateful towards anyone. So if that has happened to you, I apologize that they did not reflect Christ in their actions towards you. This video is a personal story about a bad experience I had with a church and a group of Christians that really hurt me, yet it ended up directing me to a different, healthier church, and both have allowed me to grow in my faith and better myself. So the overlying message is that nobody is perfect. Not every church or Christian is a great example of how God wants us to act towards people, but that doesn't mean every church is like that. I promise you there are plenty of amazing churches and Christians out there, and if you meet the right ones, you will be impacted positively. So please, stay with me as I tell my story, and hopefully, if you relate to it, it will encourage you to seek something better. And if you don't relate, well, I hope you enjoy story times. This is a bit of a longer video, so I apologize ahead of time. I believe in you though. You can make it through this. Just go ahead and install that attention span DLC package that Activision probably charged you $40 for, and hopefully this story is entertaining and helpful enough that you stick with me through the whole thing. Now, really quick, before I get started, let me throw out a handful of disclaimers. This is not me speaking ill of anyone else or trying to direct hatred towards any one person or church. This is just me sharing my story in hopes that it helps some of you who listen to this. For this reason, I will be using fake names for the people involved in the story. I want to put names to people so the story is easier to follow, but I want to respect privacy and keep people anonymous. I will use names that were not the names of anyone in the group, as well as the names will start with different letters of the actual names, so there are no code names or hints as to their actual identities in this video. I have no harsh feelings or grudges against any of these people, and I still pray that they have amazing lives and grow to become more Christ-like with each passing day. So please, don't think this is me venting about people. Again, this is supposed to be an encouraging testimonial video. Alright, now we can get started with the story. I think it would be easiest to start with some context. Historical context, if you will, since the story begins, well, basically my whole life, but mainly in the fall of 2020. Throughout my life, I'd always been what one would consider a nominal Christian, meaning I claimed to be a follower of Christ, however, I really didn't act like it. Yeah, I went to youth group every week and did all the church events, but my actions outside of the church really didn't reflect my beliefs at all, and it was almost like I was two different people. When I finally got to college, I joined up in a campus ministry, and my discipleship group leader, let's call him Hunter, again, fake names, not using the real ones in this video, and he was a really good dude. He was very knowledgeable, had an awesome testimony, and really led us well. Not just our small group of guys, but the campus ministry as a whole. I was growing a lot as a Christian, and I was really starting to take my faith more seriously. However, the closer you get with God, the more Satan is going to try and tug at you to pull you away. In my case, Satan was winning this battle. I won't get into specifics, but I was living in unchecked and unrepented sin, and it was controlling my life. I began to be less enthusiastic about my D group, and I was trying to find every reason imaginable to get out of participating. I was coming up with every lie in the book to hide it from my D group, my friends, my roommates, everyone. Eventually, I got to a point where Hunter had advised me to make a certain decision that was obviously the right course of action for me to take, but I decided to go against his wise counsel. However, This is when the wheels started turning in my head and was really the beginning of me eventually changing for the better. I became really convicted about my sin, but I wasn't quite ready to give it up. For whatever reason, the way I ended up reacting to the situation was to blame Hunter for a bunch of stuff and basically insult him to his face, saying that I had a bunch of issues with how he was leading, and that I had no interest in being associated with him or the campus ministry. At that point, I also stopped going to the same church as him, which also happened to be the same church I had been going to since I was 8 years old. It took a while to realize what I had done, and how I had been completely in the wrong, and I had been wanting to apologize for a couple of years at this point, but more on that later. Now, I wasn't going to church, and didn't from probably around March of 2021 to the summer of 2022. When I graduated, an old friend of mine from high school, we'll refer to him as Arthur, invited me to start going to his church with him and to start attending their young adults group on Thursday nights, to which I accepted. Now, if you're wondering to yourself, when does the meat of this story happen? Well, the context is finished, and this is the true beginning of the story you came here to listen to. So, I had started going to this new church. It was a little weird at first since it was a non-denominational church, and I grew up Presbyterian, but I got used to it after a while. I still wasn't fond of a few things in the service, but we're not going to get into denominational stuff in this video. I immediately threw myself into this group that first night, and it was amazing. We had deep discussions, talked about different ideas and viewpoints, and how to implement things into our life, that kind of stuff. I felt welcomed as soon as I walked in that first night and started making friends immediately. It stayed this way for a couple months, and then the fall came and people started to leave. College students going back to school, people moving. We even had one guy get shipped out to the army, but things started to change as the regular attendees started to change. Going into the fall, we started to grow as a group, and since we went into a new season, both literally and metaphorically, we started changing up the discussions. We started to have more topical discussions instead of reading out of the Bible and talking about it. And it started to get to a point to where we were all just sitting and sharing ideas and viewpoints and not actually learning anything or spending any time in the Word. So, a few of us wanted to try and make a change. I said the story began before, but this is really, truly where the story begins. Things went downhill real quick. One thing that a few of us had talked about was that we wanted to spend more time actually reading and talking about the Bible, instead of watching videos and talking about them, or just basing our entire night discussion about what do we all think about this thing. Arthur, who I mentioned earlier, decided to step up and lead a 6-week study through Hebrews 11. During this process, 4 of us met up to discuss some possible plans going forward, and their fake names are Arthur, James, and Nancy. These specific names will be important later. Now, Nancy is the daughter of Pastor William, but we'll talk about him later in this story. Basically, this meeting was a lot of figuring out series to go through, such as reading through certain books of the Bible, seeing what the Bible says about this topic. You get the point. People seemed to be really into the Hebrew series we were going through, and the whole time Arthur was trying to encourage others to step up and lead their own night or their own series. But nobody was taking the initiative, so once those 6 weeks were over, it went back to the shallow, topical stuff based on our own feelings, not what the Bible says. The young adults ministry had a couple people from the church who were appointed to oversee and direct the ministry, and the 4 of us who had met up that one night had talked to them about our plans. And so the supervisors, in lack of a better word, brought these ideas to Pastor William, since it was a church-sanctioned ministry and the lessons and topics needed to be approved, which makes total sense. For reference, there were 4 supervisors, and they play a role a bit later in the story, but we're not quite there yet. So now, we've reached our New Year's trip. I'd say there were probably 14 of us that want to spend the weekend in a house in the mountains to celebrate the turning of the new year. And this is where a lot of things started to snowball downward. There was a lot of alcohol in that house. I will admit, I did some drinking too, but I was very careful with the amount I consumed. I was 21 at the time, and we were very adamant that the 2 or 3 underage guys that were with us, underage as in not 21, the legal drinking age in the States, not minors, they didn't drink anything, so props are to be given there. However, there were definitely a few guys who got hammered, and one guy even drank so much that he got sick, and someone had to drive separately to take him home early. The things that were being said were also pretty bad. I'm pretty sure the guys were operating under the mindset of, we're all Christians here, so we can be pretty lax on the things we say since we don't judge one another. Which, let me be very clear, is a very incorrect mindset to have. We should always strive to keep our words and conversations appropriate. As Ephesians 4:29 says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So, yeah, I don't think cussing a lot, bragging about performing premarital sexual acts with your girlfriend, or pressuring the other guys into drinking more is wholesome and uplifting. Also, let me be clear, I was guilty of this as well, and it doesn't matter if I did it more or less than the other guys. What matters is I still did it, and it was unacceptable. This isn't me making an excuse, but it was an environment that was conducive to sinful speech and influence, and I fell victim to it, and that is my fault. The next day, as we were driving home and making stops along the way, we had 2 guys who were driving extremely recklessly with both of their cars full of passengers. Like, I'm talking about sedans at max capacity. They'd be going 60 plus on winding mountain roads with no guardrails, weaving in and out of cars on the highway at probably 90 to 100 miles an hour. And they actually raced a couple of dudes, and at one point they even moved their cars so close together that the driver of one of the cars leaned out and high-fived the passenger of the other car. Thankfully, I was in neither vehicle, and my driver was being safe, but still. So, yeah, not a great picture of Christ-like activity. Fast forward to the next following weeks after this trip. A lot of the guys on the trip are bragging and telling stories about that weekend, and even playing them up to be more intense than the actual events just so it made a better story. They'd even made some pact of, what happens on the trip stays on the trip, but they kept telling me stories anyway. It got to a point where it made a lot of the girls uncomfortable, and this plays a part in the beach trip we took that summer, but I'll get to that trip in a bit. Yeah, I know, a lot of things I'll get to. Like I said, it's a bit of a long story, but it's one I feel I need to tell, and I pray that it's helpful to someone who hears it. These stories about the New Year's trip painted certain people in a bad light, which changed people's opinions of them, one of which was a guy who was away at college and couldn't even share his side of the story. Also, 2 guys whose fake names will be Luke and Ryan come into play. These 2 guys have been good friends for a while. A couple of weeks after the trip, Luke starts dating Ryan's sister, and then Ryan starts some silly beef with Luke, and this actually ended up dividing the entire group into Team Ryan and Team Luke, which was really stupid. And this beef went on for months. Actually, to this day, which is now January 2025, I don't even know if they ever worked things out, and this started about 2 years ago at this point. On top of these overblown stories and this pointless feud, the actions of the people were getting increasingly worse. People were talking bad about each other behind their backs. Conversation afterward was very unbiblical. Just a lot of things that made me feel like something was very wrong, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. My enthusiasm for this group had really diminished, and I had gotten to a point where it made me not even really want to go on Thursday nights, and I just started to realize that I had rarely even been attending church on Sunday mornings over the past couple of months, and nobody even had anything to say about it. That to me really shows that they didn't really care about their peers' walk with Christ, or they just didn't care enough to even notice that I wasn't there. Either way, this didn't sit well with me at all. I'm not saying it was their responsibility to make sure I went to church on Sundays, but I'm saying that we were all called to mention to our brothers and sisters when they may be slipping, correct them, and help guide them back to where they're supposed to be, and this was not being done at all. All these realizations made me make a decision. I was really going to step up. Remember that comfort I mentioned earlier? The one where the guys thought that they could say whatever they want? Well, that started carrying over into group time, and there was one guy who took it way too far, who was James, one of the guys who had been in that meeting where we were trying to make a change to the group. He would constantly make jokes that were really messed up, insulting, and just completely uncalled for, and it got to a point where people didn't want to be around him because he was making them so uncomfortable. I finally had enough of it and asked him to get dinner with me one night and talk about it. I prefaced the conversation by saying something along the lines of, I want to talk to you about the way you present yourself and the things you say, and I want to make sure that you understand how your actions affect others. I also want to give you the chance to speak about anything that you think I do that needs to be addressed, or any areas of my character that need to be addressed. I did this so it wouldn't seem like an attack or an intervention, and I also thought it would be wrong of me to not open up myself for correction. Therefore, we could better each other. The conversation actually went very well. James was very receptive to the things I was telling him and was very thankful that I had taken the time to talk to him aside from the others and help him be a better person. I left this conversation feeling very encouraged, but as it turns out, it was a fruitless conversation and nothing changed. If anything, it actually got worse. The group continued to become even less impactful and less focused on growing our spiritual relationships. It felt almost worthless going because it felt like everyone just saw the conversational part of the night, the entire purpose of us meeting together each week, as a prerequisite to hanging out and not taking our discussions seriously so we would end sooner than the conversation was dead. I'm starting to get to a point where I'm rambling a bit to try and fit in bits of information because I'm not sure where to fit them in, so I'll take a second to mention a few things. There was one day I had gotten off work, and I just wanted to come home and stream on Twitch. I'd been thinking about streaming all day, and I couldn't wait to go live when I got home. I'd also forgotten that it was Thursday, which is the day we met as a group. I had barely been live for maybe about 20 minutes before a bunch of people started flooding into my stream. I was really excited for a second, but then I realized it was a bunch of guys from the group who had come into my stream to make fun of me and insult me for not being at group. One guy actually took it upon himself to text me directly and insult me. Came to find out later that one of the supervisors that I had mentioned earlier actually put my stream up on the big TV in our meeting space so that everyone could see it. This actually affected me so much that I stopped streaming for a few weeks in fear that they would come back to my stream and make fun of me more. And I'm also still very hesitant to tell people that I stream to this day because I'm insecure about it. One thing I'm very adamant about, whether it's a church, a business, whatever, what brings you in is what keeps you there. If the quality of the product is what drew you to the company, the quality of the product is what's going to make you a repeat customer. If you like sound biblical teaching, then sound biblical teaching is what's going to keep you at church. I'm not saying the teaching was unbiblical, I'm just giving that as an example. The reason I mentioned this was the super over-the-top Easter ceremony that was so different from any other Sunday service. Just didn't sit right with me at all. The very first service I had attended at this church was a fairly normal service, but obviously filled with a bit of extra flair and decoration for Easter, and rightfully so. We're celebrating the resurrection of Christ after all. However, this Sunday was so different that it actually made me uncomfortable. There was a light show, an overly dramatic spoken word presentation, some crazy video production, all sorts of stuff that made it seem like we were at some sort of celebrity concert, like we're at a Sabrina Carpenter concert or something. It was just super flashy the whole time, and it was completely overstimulating and unnecessary. Now, after mentioning the Easter thing, this leads me to the two big last straws, if you will, that made me decide to quit going to this church. The weeks leading up to Easter Sunday, Pastor William had come onto the stage and practically begged the congregation to go on Google and flood the church with good reviews so that the people would come to that church for Easter. He had never preached a sermon the entire year I had been attending, and the only time he ever came on stage was to ask the congregation for money. And the way he did it didn't point to the example of sacrifice that Christ laid out for us. It was essentially just, hey, we need money and you better give it to us or you aren't a supportive member of our church, and that was that. They also avoided using the word member and instead used partner, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. We don't partner with God. We are members of his family. We become members of a church because it's a commitment to the congregation that we will support them, love them, help raise the children under biblical principles, all that stuff. We don't partner with each other. This is a family. But I digress. Anyway, this Pastor William guy never really sat right with me. Now it's springtime, and he comes to our Thursday night meeting. He essentially gives the group a presentation about all these changes with the young adults ministry going forward. Essentially, none of them had anything to do with the conversations that had happened previously. After that presentation, I had gone downstairs to talk with him about my thoughts, and he seemed quite receptive to them, and he even shook my hand, looked me in the eyes, and said, "I'll be in touch with you. I'm going to need you as my point man on this." What did he proceed to do? Not say a single word to me for maybe 2 months, and plan everything with his daughter behind my back. And his daughter, Nancy, from earlier, was supposed to be our point of contact about these matters. Neither of them said anything to me at all, and as far as I was aware, they were still planning, but one Thursday night, Pastor William came to present all the changes that were starting effective immediately. I won't get into the specifics, but let's just say that nobody was happy with the changes implemented. However, one big change I will mention is the fact that the ministry was now broken up into 2 groups. We had the college group, which was geared towards college-age members, so basically 18 to 21, 18 to 22, depending on when you graduated, or people who didn't go to school who were still in that age range. The other group, which they called the career group, which I still think is a really stupid name, but whatever. And this was basically those of us who had either graduated college or were over 22, trying to keep people together who were in similar stages of life. This change didn't sit well with a lot of the attendees, and apparently I wasn't the only person who this wasn't communicated to beforehand. Apparently, none of the supervisors had been told any of this prior to the announcement, so they found out about it at the same time we did. I don't remember the exact time frame, but I think it was within a week or two that every single supervisor had stepped down, effective immediately after that announcement. Was it the right way to handle it? Maybe not, but it's what happened, and in order for them to take that sudden of an action collectively, means that there had to be something going on behind closed doors for quite a while. Anyway, the split happened. I was in the career group, so we went over to a different area for our meeting. Apparently, there was already a huge unit planned out that we were going to be going through together, and none of this was mentioned to me like I was promised. Let me be clear, it isn't that I wanted control, it's just that I was told something to my face and was lied to about it from a pastor, of all people. Not to mention, the 2 people leading the group were Nancy, the pastor's daughter, and another girl who I'll call Janice. Janice is known for talking bad about people behind their backs and pretending to be people's friends and gossiping more than most people. Remember how I mentioned earlier on the New Year's trip how there was a guy who bragged about premarital sex with his girlfriend? Well, that guy is dating Janice, so yeah. Not exactly the best person to be leading a ministry group. But anyway, even after all this fuss about splitting the group and the reasoning with all the age differences, there was a dude, let's call him Greg, who was 19 and had snuck over into the older group because he was better friends with the older guys who attended. Nobody ever corrected him about this, and it even turned into somewhat of a joke that he continuously attended the incorrect meeting. So now I'm wondering, what is even the point of having the split if we're just going to allow anyone to go to either group based on who their friends are? This blatant disregard for the guidelines set in place just added yet another thing onto the growing pile of things that bothered me. So fast forward about 2 months later. I can't remember correctly, but I think I'd skipped out on most of the Thursday night meetings after the first couple. The same guys who planned the New Year's trip had also planned a summer beach trip. There was initially going to be a large group of us, but a lot of people dropped out for various reasons. Some people dropped just because of scheduling issues, but there were a lot of girls who didn't feel comfortable going because of the stories from New Year's trip. There were a lot of those who didn't want to go because of the stupid ongoing feud between Luke and Ryan, which had been going on for months at this point. So now, not only is our ministry divided, we also have plenty of people uncomfortable with hanging out socially with the guys because of overblown stories of getting drunk and doing stupid things that guys bragged about to look cool and be funny. We actually had to withdraw our deposit and get a different house because people weren't paying or they were dropping out. So me, being the kind person I am, decided to stick out my commitment and go on the trip so the others would be able to have their beach trip, even though I really didn't want to go. The trip was 3 days and 2 nights. We would show up the afternoon of the first day, stay 2 nights, then on the third and final day, we would spend a couple hours out at the beach and then drive home in the afternoon. Before I continue with this part of the story, let me be clear. I didn't have an issue with everyone on the trip. There were a handful of people in the ministry that were good, genuine people who really strived to be Christ-like and wanted to grow in community. However, most people on the trip were not among these, and that is where the issues continued, and why the last straw came during this trip. On the first night, somehow, and this was hilariously actually a pretty common occurrence among the ministry attendees, a few of us got on the topic of issues within the ministry. There couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 of us in this conversation, but somehow it turned into everyone at the house all sitting in one big circle in the living room having this conversation. While everyone was talking, and after hearing out a lot of the people, it dawned on me that so many of them were voicing issues that they themselves played a part in, or things they witnessed and did nothing about or even encouraged. The lack of introspection and accountability is what set in stone my decision to leave this church and the ministry after this trip. After all the efforts I had put in to make this young adults ministry better, nothing had changed and everything had actually gotten so much worse. There's something to be said about sticking it out in a situation where God is not at the forefront and striving to make a difference for the kingdom. But after being here for over a year, seeing no positive change, and actually getting to the point where my own walk with Christ was suffering, I decided that I'd had enough. I could continue with the rest of the trip, but at this point my mind had already been made up, and continuing wouldn't be helpful in this context. Growing up, I had always gone to Presbyterian churches. I really appreciate how the denomination is structured, and I like the emphasis on sound doctrine and biblical teaching. After being at a non-denominational church for a year, I decided to return to the PCA. While on the beach trip, I texted my mom saying that I was interested in visiting this local PCA church that my parents had been visiting. The next Sunday after the beach trip, I went to that church for the first time, and now, over a year later, I call that church my home. The very first day I walked in there, everyone was so welcoming and intentional, and it immediately made me feel like I was returning home. Similarly to someone returning home for the first time after a rough semester of college. I don't remember the circumstances, but that next week, my parents weren't going to be attending church, so I went by myself. Now this is a huge step for someone like me. I have social anxiety and I hate being in spaces where I don't know anybody, but I was so excited to go back to this church that didn't really even matter to me. Immediately after the second service, I knew this is where I belonged, and I approached one of the pastors about getting connected and becoming a youth ministry leader. which I've now been leading the high school guys youth group for almost 3 semesters now. I now serve in the booth on Sunday mornings and have great relationships with this church. I've met so many amazing people, and I'm so glad to say that I truly do have a home with my church. I could go on about all the amazing things about my church, but that would take a while to do, and this isn't a part of the main point of this video. I'm pretty much done telling my story here, but this last little bit just solidified my decision to switch churches. After I had attended the new church that second week, I had made my decision to stay. This also meant that I was no longer going to attend the young adults ministry that this whole video is about. Even though I was leaving, there was still a handful of dudes I was close with, and the guy I'm calling Arthur, I had known him for almost a decade at this point. I tried to stay in contact with them, make plans, and continue to be their friend, even though through all the bad stuff over that year-long process, there were still some genuinely good dudes in that group. But my efforts were fruitless. Yeah, maybe we texted a bit for a while, maybe we met up once or twice, but that beach trip was pretty much the end of it. Very quickly it got to the point where I never heard from any of them again, even Arthur, which really hurt. We had been friends for so long, and we had a running tradition where I would come visit him for a weekend at his university each semester, but he stopped inviting me and I just had to ask him about it. After 3 separate times asking, he just blew me off and never gave me any follow-up. He also wouldn't respond to any of my texts or calls for weeks, and eventually not at all. I'd given up on trying because my initiations weren't doing anything, so I was going to leave the ball in their court. If they reached out to me, I'd be happy to oblige them, but nobody ever reached out to me again, so I just gave up on trying to be their friend entirely. So yeah, everyone who I thought were my friends had just given up on being my friend, so I just stopped trying. Another video coming relatively soon about being lonely and having no friends, so stay tuned for that. But alright, now it's time for your favorite part of the video, me wrapping this thing up. I really want to reiterate what I said in the introductory portion of this video. This story is not intended to spread hate towards anybody or paint people out to be evil. This is also not me taking an opportunity to let out some anger or resentment. This is me sharing an honest and real story that some of you might be able to relate to in hopes that you can see that you are not alone when it comes to witnessing Christ be misrepresented by those who claim to be his followers. Also, in saying that last statement, I'm not making a judgment on the faith or salvation of the people mentioned in this story. Quite literally, we claim to be followers of Christ when we are Christians. I claim to be a follower of Christ, so do not think my choice of words is passing judgment. People's actions do not affect the reality of God's love and sovereignty. We have an example through Jesus Christ as to how we should live. And we have an entire book that never once tells us to mistreat people. The sad truth is, everyone falls short of the expectations of God. We are all imperfect, and we all misrepresent God to other people through our actions, which I know I have done plenty of times. So has literally every single person to ever live other than Jesus himself. So whenever you are mistreated by a Christian or a specific church as a whole, don't let that affect your view of God. I promise you, there are plenty of amazing churches and Christians out there who would love to welcome you and love you like we're supposed to. A great church will bless you in so many ways, and I encourage you to find one. I'm always happy to answer questions and talk with you in the comments.